Welcome to Bunch of Outlaws. My name is Andrew, and today we're going to explore the hidden costs of a big turbo. What you need to know before spending your money. So, in looking at the costs of a big turbo, today is not focused on the actual turbo itself and all of the little pieces needed to install that turbo. It's more going to be about all of the other things that you have to really think about whenever you're going to increase your power levels substantially. You're going from 200 horsepower to now 600 horsepower or more, and what that's going to do for the rest of your car, as well as your intended use of the car, how that's going to affect all the various components of the car. So let's look at those various components and determine what are the things that are really going to be affected. Now, the first thing that we need to talk about is the actual engine itself. And there's a lot of stuff to go over, but let's start with the block. Now, the engine block, depending on whether you have a closed deck or an open deck block, needs to be considered. Now, if you have a closed deck block, you're starting off pretty good. But if you have an open deck block, like in some of the Hondas, then what that means is that the piston skirts are completely encased in water all the way surrounding them. And that means that they're completely floating. So if you get to a lot of power, a lot of pressure on that piston, then things can move around quite substantially, and it's going to possibly cause for some major catastrophic engine damage. So you'll have to consider all the various options for reinforcing that. Now again, if you have a closed deck block, which means that instead of it being a floating piston skirt, you'll just have water jackets, small little water jackets surrounding it that will cool the engine. So in regards to the rest of the bottom end, we have the pistons, the rods, and then the actual crankshaft. Depending on your car, the pistons could be forged, the rods could be a very strong design, and the crankshaft itself could be forged. I know that on the Audi and Volkswagen 1.8 engines, the pistons are very strong, the crankshaft is extremely strong, and the only real worry that you have up to, like, say, 600 horsepower is the actual rods itself on the short block. So look up your car and consider what it is you need to be cognizant of and wary of. Now, the next thing for the engine is going to be the actual cylinder head itself. And with the cylinder head, that's not necessarily going to be something that's going to prevent you from making a heck of a lot of power. It's going to cap you quite substantially, or at least going to make it very difficult to make that power. And the primary thing there is going to be the camshafts, or camshaft, depending on how many you have. And with that, if you have a standard turbocharged car, turbocharged from the factory, most of the time they are sized for a very lower RPM use so that you have an immediate punch from the turbo, and that gives you a nice broad torque band, very usable. But you're watching this video, you're looking at going with a very big turbo, and so that's going to change that power range from, say, 2,000 to 5,500 RPMs to, say, 3, 4, 5,000 to 7, 8, 9,000 RPMs, or even more. And with that, you have to have a camshaft that'll make power efficiently at that RPM ranges. So just be aware of that when you're going through and you're building your car. The actual valve springs and retainers, which that dictates RPM. So a higher strength valve spring will allow the cylinder, or allow the camshafts to still make contact, the lifters to make contact with the camshafts at the higher end range. So as you move up in the RPMs, then the more you have to focus on those type of components, the valves, the valve springs, and all of the other little things that is going to be dependent on your particular engine. And then finally, on the heads, we have the actual heads themselves and the casting of the ports. You'll have to consider whether or not doing either a mild port job or a port match or a major port job will be beneficial to your particular application. If you find during some research that, oh, these heads flow great up to 600 horsepower and you're planning on making 600 horsepower, then you probably don't need to do much. Maybe just clean up some castings and port match just for your own peace of mind. But if you find that, hey, these heads really start to limit flow at about 400 horsepower, oh, okay, let's start doing some major port work or send out the heads for some port work. And that can be a very expensive cost. So now we have the base engine covered. We need to look at the other various components. And we talked about the head. Let's talk about the intake manifold. If you're putting a lot of air through an intake manifold that's not designed for it, a lot of times you're going to need to increase the plenum volume and maybe increase some flow on the runners to be able to handle the amount of air that you're going to be pushing through. And when you do that, you're also going to be needing to look at probably a larger throttle body. So in most cases, many applications have either aftermarket or guys that have built custom intake manifolds, and that can be an expensive cost. Some of them out there are only a couple $100. Some of them are $1,500, $2,000. So just be wary. That can be a very, very expensive cost as well. Now, another component of the engine that you're going to need to consider is the PCV system, or the positive crankcase ventilation system. And with that, as you're increasing the amount of boost going through the engine, you're going to be increasing the amount of pressure going down into the cylinders, and therefore the amount of air that's going to be escaping past the piston rings into the crankcase. And with that pressure will do a lot of bad things for your engine. Mostly it's going to create leaks throughout the engine itself and just give you a very bad time and quite a lot of smoke. So with that, you need to consider ways of evacuating that air pressure somehow. And the best solution that most guys use is a catch can system. And not something really small at this point. It's going to be something fairly large. And in fact, you probably already have one. But you're going to need to increase the size and the amount of ports going into it. Whether you do one or two from the valve cover or something else, and you're going to have to do something from the actual crankcase itself. So it's at this point that you need to really start considering that. And that's not necessarily a huge cost, but it's something you do need to look at. Now, speaking of pressure, you're going to have to evacuate that pressure somehow in the intake tract with a blow-off valve or a diverter valve. And most turbocharged cars in the factory have one of these two, but they're typically fairly weak, especially on the diverter valve side. A lot of them are plastic, and they can only handle a certain amount of pressure until they really start to fail. So there are billet versions like Forged or other various brands that have a very good diverter valve and blow-off valves that will give you that turbo noise that is very well liked, as well as actually do some good. So consider that should only be $200 to $300. Now, another potentially large cost is going to be the actual intercooler. Hopefully you have an intercooler from the factory, but some of them don't. And those factory intercoolers are only sized for the amount of power that the factory turbo generates from stock. And so as you start to get more and more power, you're going to need a larger and more efficient intercooler. And in some cases, you can't just go with a big universal 3-inch intercooler. You're going to need to go with something custom due to spacing in your front end. And those can go very expensive. Instead of $200, $300, $400, they might be $1,500 on up. And then you also have plumbing to consider as well. If you're going to go with a custom intercooler and fitting it to the car, you're probably going to have to go with some custom piping, because you're going from a 2-inch to now maybe a 3-inch set of piping from the turbo all the way to the throttle body. So more things to consider on that side. Now, one of the major things that you're going to have to look at is fueling. I have a really detailed video on this that I'll put a link in the description, and I encourage you to pause this video and watch that one and then come back to this video, because there's a lot of details on that video, and I'm just going to go over it in brief here. And the topics for that video are going to be the fuel pump, the fuel injectors, the fuel lines, the wiring, the tune, and the regulator. So take a look at that video. It's something that you definitely need to watch, because fueling is going to completely limit how much power you can make, because you have to support that power with fuel to make it. So watch that video. And then finally, on the engine side is going to be the actual exhaust. And from the turbo back, most of the time you're going to have to go with a custom exhaust, because that turbo, if you're going to be a full frame turbo, is going to be physically larger or just different inlets and outlets. That's going to require you to go with something custom. Now, the exception to that is if you have like a hybrid turbo, and then in that case it's basically made to bolt on. But you really should be considering this anyways, because that's the factory exhaust, or whatever exhaust you currently have might be limiting how much power you can really push through that particular exhaust. Now, another factor you might consider is if you're going to go with a full frame turbo and you have a factory manifold that is got a very small output, you're probably going to have to change your exhaust manifold. So that can be a very expensive cost that needs to be considered. Now that finishes up the engine, but let's go ahead and move on to the drivetrain. Now the first thing with the drivetrain is going to be the clutch. And the factory clutches only will handle a little bit more than the factory amount of power. And that's 25%, maybe 50%, depending on the car. And in some cases, not even 25%. They're like at factory levels, and then they start to really just deteriorate after a short period of time. So you need to look at clutches. Those are potentially really expensive, and you have to size your, you have to plan your clutch for how much power you're gonna be making. And I'm not talking about now, I'm talking about in the future. If you have a 600 horsepower turbo, plan for a 600 horsepower clutch or more, because that clutch is gonna be one of those limiting factors for you. So with that clutch, you have the actual clutch disc itself, then you have the pressure plate, and most of the time you're going to need to consider a flywheel. So it's not a couple $100 expense in most cases. It's more like a $700, $800, all the way up to a couple $1,000. So another really big expense here. Now, another expense that you might not be considering is your actual engine mounts and transmission mounts. There's a lot of movement when you start to really increase your power, as the engine goes from tilting like this to all of a sudden tilting like this, and it's going to just wear out your engine mounts quite substantially. And so you need to consider either upgrading your mounts to a much higher density mount or even a solid mount. I don't personally like solid mounts, but you need to figure something. And it might just be going with a factory style upgraded mount from one car to a different car, but do your research and find out what works for you. Now the next thing that's going to be a limiting factor and potentially break on you is going to be your axles. Depending on how much power you're going to make, what kind of tires you're going to run, how you're going to be driving, the axles might be a limiting factor and you're going to need to upgrade those. And depending on your application, that only might be maybe $300-400, but it might be something where you have to completely change out your hub assembly to go with a much beefier spline, all this kind of configuration that's going to be really expensive. So be aware of that as you start to make big numbers, like 600 plus. And then finally we have the transmission itself. So hopefully you're building a platform that has a very robust transmission from the factory, or at least one that's available and not too expensive. But in some cases that's not the case, and your transmission is going to be really expensive to change over to something strong. Like for example, the 914s that I run have a really weak transmission from the factory where they only hold about 300-400 horsepower. But if you want to go much beyond that, you have to go into really, really expensive transmissions, up to $10,000-15,000. So just be aware of that and factor that into your budget. And next we have cooling. So we have the actual intercooler that we talked about earlier, but we have the radiator for the engine that is going to be something that you need to consider as well. If you're going to be making a bunch of power in road racing, then most of the time you're going to have to do something with your radiator. And if you are just mainly spending your time on just kind of daily driving, and once in a while you do a pull here or there, then it's probably not going to be something you need to consider. But let's say, for example, you do road racing. The next thing you need to consider is your oil cooler, and maybe even your power steering cooler, depending on your particular application. Those are things that you're going to need to either upgrade or watch as you start to make a lot more temps. And so with, say, the oil cooler, you're going to need to go with either an external oil cooler with a replacement for the factory, or maybe a sandwich style plate to add an external oil cooler, or simply just go with a larger factory oil cooler. For example, the Volkswagen Audi 1.8 engines, they have a factory oil cooler that's about that big, and the Audi 2.7 liter engines, they have one that's about that big that will bolt on with a couple of little things. And it's a very simple system. And that's what I run, and it works great. Next, we've made all this power, and we're going down the drag strip, or we're going down country roads at speeds we shouldn't, and come up to a stop where we need to slow down. And maybe the first time is okay, but the second, the third, and the fourth is going to lead to some problems if you have factory brakes. So that upgrade might be just pads that have a higher heat range, or maybe pads and rotors, or maybe pads, rotors, and calipers. It's all going to be dependent on what you have from the factory and what you have available to you. But brakes are definitely something they're going to need to consider at some point. Now, from brakes, we have wheels and tires. If you go with a really big set of brakes, most likely you're going to have to go with a larger set of wheels to be able to fit over those brakes. And if you're going to be making a whole bunch of power, you're most likely going to need to go with some wider wheels and some wider, more stickier tires to be able to put that power to the ground, or else you're just doing a smoke show, which maybe that's what you're into. But it's going to be a pretty decent expense, and you already know how much tires and wheels can potentially cost for you. So with that, as you add tire grip, your drivetrain, as we previously talked about, is going to be affected. So it's all a lot of things that you got to consider. Now, we went down a pretty slippery slope that basically went from a big turbo to a complete car build, but that's almost what you're going to be looking at when you're developing a car into something that you can actually drive at a pretty substantial power range. So it might be that, hey, that 300 horsepower setup is not that bad looking now, but I don't want to be the one to discourage you from making that ultimate really cool setup and spending quite a lot of money, because I gotta tell you, it's awesome. And being part of a car community and building a car up is just a lot of fun. But if it's going to keep you off the road for 2 or 3, maybe 4 years as you afford everything, maybe start looking at things in steps. And instead of building your car to have the engine first, you do the engine last after you do all of the other various components that you might need. Or maybe you buy the big turbo, you install it, and you just turn the boost all the way down until you have what you need to be able to handle everything. So a couple of considerations, but I encourage you to have fun with it, and I'll see you guys out there. Thanks again.